There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not announce itself with tears or loud grieving. It is the kind that settles into the architecture of a life so gradually that the person living it begins to mistake it for personality, begins to call it independence, begins to wear it like a coat that fits so well they forget it was ever cold outside. Sarah Ashvale knew this loneliness the way she knew the grain of the wooden floor beneath her feet, the way she knew the exact sound the old cottage door made when the autumn wind pushed against it, the way she knew the particular quality of silence that fell over the village of Thresh every night when the last lamp was extinguished and the world decided, once again, that it could exist perfectly well without her. She had not always been this fluent in solitude. There had been a time, very early, when she remembered warmth, the smell of her mother's hair, the sound of her father's voice reading something she could not quite recall, just the cadence of it, the rise and fall, the sense that the world had edges, and inside those edges she was held. Then the fever came, and took them both in the same brutal winter week, and Sarah was 5 years old, and suddenly the world had no edges at all. The village had taken her in the way villages take in orphaned children, which is to say functionally and without particular tenderness. She was fed. She was clothed. She was assigned a small cottage at the furthest edge of Thresh, close to the tree line of the Ashwood, which everyone in the village agreed was a suitable place for an omega of no particular status and no family name worth mentioning. The Ashwood was considered cursed by most of the village elders, a forest that predated the current pack territories by so many centuries that the oldest maps simply labeled it with a single word, written in a script nobody alive could read anymore. Children were warned not to enter it. Adults avoided it instinctively, the way animals avoid places where something old and powerful has chosen to rest. Sarah had grown up with its shadow falling across her window every morning, and she had never been afraid of it. If anything, she felt a kinship with something that had existed so long it had been forgotten. Something that continued anyway. She had found the altar by accident when she was 12, exploring the root cellar beneath her cottage, and discovering a small alcove in the stone wall that the previous occupant had clearly used for something private and deliberate. There were faded carvings in the rock, symbols she did not recognize but that her fingers traced with a strange sense of recognition, the way you might recognize a word in a language you have never spoken but somehow understand. In the center of the alcove there was a shallow depression, perfectly sized for a candle. She did not know, at 12, whose altar it was or what tradition had built it. She knew only that something in her chest responded to it, the way a compass responds to north, with certainty and without explanation. She had gone to the village market the next morning, spent the small coin she had saved from mending work on a single white candle, and that night she had lit it and sat before it, and feeling slightly foolish and entirely alone, had whispered the first prayer she had ever constructed entirely for herself. She had not prayed to any of the official pack deities, the territorial spirits that the village shaman invoked at seasonal gatherings, the ancestor wolves that the Alpha families claimed as divine lineage. Those felt like prayers that belonged to other people, prayers with addresses already written on them. She prayed instead to the story she had heard once from an old woman named Vesna, who had come through Thresh on a trading route, and who had, in exchange for a meal and a night's shelter, told Sarah a story about the time before packs, the time before territories and hierarchies and the whole elaborate machinery of rank that governed every werewolf life. Vesna had called it the First Age, and she had described a single being who had existed at the beginning of everything supernatural. Not a god exactly, but the first of their kind. The original pattern from which all wolves were eventually drawn. She called him the Primordial, and she said his name was lost now, replaced by titles and myths and the kind of careful forgetting that powerful institutions perform on things that threaten their authority. She said some people still believed he existed somewhere, sleeping or watching or simply waiting for a reason to speak again. She said there were old families who had kept the practice of lighting candles for him, not to summon him, because that was not something a candle could do, but as a gesture of acknowledgement, a way of saying to the darkness, "I know you are real, even if no one else remembers." Vesna had left the next morning before Sarah woke up, but the story had stayed, the way certain stories do. embedding themselves in the soft tissue of a young person's imagination and quietly growing roots. So at 12 years old, with her first candle burning in the stone alcove beneath her cottage, Sarah Ashvale had whispered her first prayer to a legend. She had not asked for power. She had not asked for a mate or status or any of the things her peers at the village school spent their free periods discussing with feverish intensity. She had asked, in a voice barely above breath, for someone to see her, not to want her for a purpose, not to find her useful, just to see her, the whole of her, the real and complicated and lonely shape of her, and not look away. Nothing happened. Of course. The candle burned down and the night was quiet, and Sarah went to bed and woke up the next morning, the same orphaned Omega she had always been. But she lit another candle the following night, and the night after that. For 12 years, she lit a candle every night in that small stone alcove, and if the prayers changed over time, becoming more complex, more specific, carrying the accumulated weight of a life being lived in real time, the core of them never changed. She was not performing magic. She was not following a ritual she had read in any book. She was simply speaking into the dark on the chance that something in the dark was listening. Because the alternative, the silence of a universe that contained no listeners at all, was the one thing she had never been able to fully accept. If you had asked anyone in Thresh to describe Sarah Ashvale, they would have used words like quiet and competent. She worked as a healer's assistant, having taught herself herbalism from the small library the village maintained, demonstrating a knowledge of plant medicine that the official healer, a beta named Corvin, had eventually stopped resenting and started relying on. She was precise with her hands. She was careful with dosages. She was good with frightened patients in the way that people who have themselves been frightened often are, because they know that fear is not irrational and should not be spoken to as if it were. The pack hierarchy of Thresh placed her firmly at the bottom, an unmated Omega with no family lineage and no patron Alpha, which meant she was paid less than her work warranted and consulted less than her knowledge deserved. But she had long ago made a private peace with the particular unfairness of her situation. What she could not make peace with was the feeling, persistent and undeniable, that she was somehow waiting for something she could not name, that her real life, whatever it was, had not yet started. She was 24 years old, and the feeling had been with her for as long as she could remember, a low hum beneath everything, patient and certain. She did not know, and had no way of knowing, that she was not praying into silence. She did not know that 12 years of candles and honest words had been accumulating somewhere, building up the way snowfall builds, each individual flake negligible, and the accumulation extraordinary. She did not know that on the other side of the thin boundary between the visible and the old, something impossibly ancient had been listening to every single word. If you are finding this story already pulling at something in your chest, I want you to hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what you think Sarah has been unknowingly building toward all these years. Because, I promise you, the answer is going to change everything you think you know about destiny and choice. And if you are new here, please subscribe, because this channel is where the stories that stay with you come to live. Now, let us talk about what was listening. Kael Donvain had watched civilizations use his absence as a blank page on which to write their justifications. He had watched pack councils invoke the primordial age as sacred precedent for laws that had nothing sacred in them. He had watched alpha bloodlines claim descent from his lineage to legitimize hierarchies he would have dismantled personally had he not long ago concluded that dismantling was not his purpose. He had been born, if born was the right word for what had happened to him, in an era so far before the current reckoning of supernatural history that the scholars who occasionally tried to trace pack origins would have needed to multiply their most ambitious estimates by a factor that made the exercise meaningless. He was not immortal in the sense of being untouchable. He was old in the sense of having endured everything. The kind of old that sits differently in the body than regular age, that accumulates not in wrinkles, but in a quality of stillness. a way of occupying space that suggested the space had been there long before the body arrived and would be there long after. He was not a god. He had never claimed to be, and had spent considerable effort over the centuries correcting the claim. When others made it, he was the first wolf, the original pattern, which meant he carried in his nature the full template from which all subsequent variations had been drawn. All the dynamic range of alpha aggression and omega gentleness, and beta pragmatism and every gradation between and beyond those categories. He contained multitudes in a way that had once been useful, and was now simply the texture of his existence. He could project the alpha command that made other wolves instinctively submit, could produce the frequency that triggered protective responses in an entire territory, could read the sense signatures of emotional states with a precision that made most wolves feel transparent in his presence. None of these abilities felt like power to him anymore. They felt like the ordinary operation of a very particular kind of body, no more remarkable than the way a bird experiences flight. What had become remarkable to him, after so long, was the experience of genuine feeling, not sensation. He had plenty of that. The world was full of sensory input, and his perception of it remained sharp in ways that occasionally startled him. But feeling, the resonant interior movement that a person produced in response to another person, the thing that philosophers across centuries had called by many names, but that Cale had come to think of simply as being moved, that had become so rare as to be almost mythological. He had loved, in his time. He had loved with the full depth that a being of his nature was capable of, and that depth was considerable. He had lost what he loved, repeatedly, in the ways that creatures with finite lifespans eventually must be lost, and he had survived the losing, because that was what he did. He survived. But after enough cycles of loving and losing, the self-protective instinct that exists in even the oldest hearts had begun to build its walls, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple mathematics of self-preservation. He had withdrawn, not from the world exactly, because the world continued to pull at him with its endless human noise and supernatural drama, but from the possibility of being genuinely moved by another person. That possibility he had put somewhere very safe, which meant somewhere very far. And then, 12 years ago, he had felt a candle. Not literally. The candle itself was physically unremarkable. A small white taper burning in a stone alcove beneath a cottage at the edge of a minor village at the border of a forest that had once been the heart of everything. What he had felt was the intention behind it, carried through the old channels that connected the first age to all subsequent ages. The spiritual infrastructure that still existed beneath the modern supernatural world, the way ancient root systems exist beneath a manicured garden. The prayer that came through those channels was simple and unperformed, and entirely without agenda. The voice of a child, asking only to be seen. It was so pure in its honesty that it had passed through every defense he had constructed around himself, the way light passes through glass, without force, without violence, simply by being exactly what it was. He had not responded. He was not cruel, but he was cautious. And a single prayer from an unknown child was not sufficient data for a being who had learned the hard way that the most earnest-seeming approaches could carry concealed ambitions. He had listened. He had continued listening the following night, and the night. After that, maintaining a passive attention the way a sleeping person maintains awareness of a familiar sound, present enough to notice but not engaged enough to constitute actual contact. What he had discovered over weeks and then months and then years of this careful listening was something that dismantled his caution so gradually he almost did not notice it happening. There was no agenda. There was no accumulating strategy. There was only a person, living an ordinary and difficult life, returning every night to the same small flame and speaking honestly about what that life contained. He had heard her at 15, grieving the first real friend she had made, and lost when a merchant family passing through Thresh had taken a liking to her work and offered the girl better prospects in the city. And Sarah had been happy for her friend and devastated for herself, and she had sat in front of her candle and tried to untangle those two true things without letting one invalidate the other. He had heard her at 18, furious about a pack ruling that had assigned a significant portion of her herbalism earnings to the official healer she worked under. A ruling she called by its real name in the privacy of her prayer, which was theft dressed in hierarchy. He had heard her at 21, on a night when loneliness had pressed so close she could barely breathe, when she had sat before the flame and said quietly that she was not asking for rescue, and was not asking for pity, and was not even sure she was asking for anything at all. She just needed to say out loud that she was still here and still trying, and still believed that somewhere in the architecture of existence there was a logic that made this amount of aloneness mean something. He had heard her laugh, the surprised delight she felt when a difficult patient recovered against the odds. He had heard her think out loud about herbalism and philosophy, and the particular cruelty of pack hierarchies and the way the Ashwood looked in morning fog. He had heard everything, and he had been moved. Steadily, incrementally, irrevocably moved. The way a cliff face is moved by water, not by force, but by patient and persistent contact. He had not planned it. He had not permitted it, in the sense that he had been the one giving permission. It had simply happened, the way the most significant things tend to happen, in the accumulation of small moments, rather than in any single dramatic rupture. Kyle Donvain, the first wolf, the primordial, the being who had been legend for so many centuries that the word legend had become insufficient, had developed what could only be called tenderness for a 24-year-old Omega in a small village who had never once asked for anything from him, except the theoretical comfort of not being entirely alone. He had still not spoken, because speaking would change everything, and he had learned to be very careful about changing things. He told himself this was wisdom. He was not certain he was being entirely honest. The autumn that changed everything began, as significant things in small villages often do, with strangers arriving. They came in 3 carriages, which was itself unusual enough to draw every resident of Thresh to their windows and doorways. Thresh was not on any major trade route, and received ordinary visitors only occasionally. 3 carriages with matched black horses and drivers in matching gray coats was the kind of arrival that meant official business, the kind of official business that minor villages at the edge of contested pack territory had learned to be nervous about. The carriages bore the seal of the Vethys Council, which was a body that most pack members encountered only in the form of edicts and taxation notices, and which existed, in the popular imagination of ordinary wolves, as the remote and impersonal machinery of governance that governed their lives without much interest in those lives as such. Sarah watched them arrive. From the window of the healing cottage, where she was grinding dried chamomile into powder, with a concentration that was mostly a way of managing her instinctive unease. Something about the arrivals produced a discomfort in her that went beyond ordinary pack politics anxiety. Her Omega instincts, which she generally regarded as reliable information about the world rather than commands to be obeyed, were producing a clear signal that she chose, for the moment, to file under attention, but not action. She noted that all 3 carriages parked in front of the village head's house. She noted that the men who emerged from them wore the kind of clothes that cost more than she earned in a year. She noted that they were all alphas, all of them projecting the particular frequency of dominant intent, that she had learned to identify the way a careful person learns to identify weather signs. Not with fear exactly, but with the full attention the information warranted. She did not know that one of them was carrying a document with her name on it. The man who came for her the following morning introduced himself as Advisor Theron Malik of the Vethys Council Bloodline Research Division, which was a title so long it should have been funny, but was delivered with such studied gravity that it succeeded in being merely ominous. He was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that had been conventionally attractive long enough to have become accustomed to being found attractive, which had given it a complacency that Sarah found immediately and instinctively unpleasant. He smiled at her, in the way powerful people smile at people they consider beneath them, with the warmth measured out carefully, just enough to indicate that he considered himself a reasonable person, not enough to suggest that her comfort was genuinely his concern. He told her, in the sitting room of the healing cottage with Corvin hovering awkwardly in the doorway, that the Council's Bloodline Research Division had been conducting a survey of regional Omega populations with particular attention to lineage anomalies. He told her that certain indicators in the regional bloodline records she had not known existed and had certainly not consented to being included in, suggested that she might carry a specific ancestral marker that was of considerable interest to the council. He told her that the council wished to invite her to the regional center at Vethis for a simple examination, a matter of a few days at most, all expenses provided for. And that this invitation carried, he said with a smile that communicated the opposite, no compulsory element whatsoever. Sarah, who had spent 24 years living at the bottom of a pack hierarchy and had developed an excellent practical education in how power communicated itself when it wanted something, heard every layer of what he was actually saying. The examination was not optional. The council had decided it had a use for her. She was being given the courtesy of pretending she had a choice, because that was cheaper than dealing with her resistance, but the choice was not real. She asked him, in a voice she kept carefully neutral, what the ancestral marker was. He told her it was a legacy sequence associated with first-age bloodlines. He said it with the practiced vagueness of someone who has been trained to disclose the minimum necessary, which meant that what he was not saying was at least as significant as what he was. She filed this information next to the discomfort still humming in her chest, and said she would need until the morning to arrange coverage for her patients. He said, of course, naturally, with the smile that did not reach his eyes. She spent that afternoon working mechanically through her patient rounds, her mind doing something underneath the ordinary surface of her day that she could only describe as a kind of taking stock, the way a person takes stock of a house before a storm, moving through the rooms and checking the foundations. She thought about what first-age bloodlines meant. She thought about the altar in her root cellar, and the 12 years of candles, and the prayers she had offered to a legend. And for the first time, she wondered, with a seriousness she had previously permitted herself only in the vaguest philosophical sense, whether something about her had always been oriented toward that altar in a way that was not purely a matter of personal mythology. She thought about the ashwood, the way her instincts had always read the forest as safe, the way her body relaxed in its proximity rather than tensing, the way she had sometimes, in the deep of night, felt something like a response coming from the direction of those old trees, something she had always explained to herself as the human tendency to find meaning in the world's noise. That night, she went to her root cellar and lit her candle, and she did not whisper a prayer. She sat in front of the flame in silence for a long time, and then she said, in a voice that was steady because she had decided it would be, I think something is about to happen, and I think it is going to be bad before it is anything else. I think whatever I am, whatever is in my blood that they want, it is about to stop being a private thing. I want you to know. I am not afraid. I want you to know I have been coming here every night for 12 years, and I have never asked you to rescue me, and I am not starting tonight. I just wanted to say the truth out loud before I have to go say the polite version of it. She blew out the candle and went to bed and tried to sleep and managed it, eventually, the sleep of someone who has done what they could and accepted what they could not control, which is its own kind of courage even when no one is watching. But something was watching, and what it had just heard had broken through the last of its careful distance. The walls that had held for 12 years, the deliberate non-engagement, the passive attention maintained as a kind of almost presence that was safer than the alternative, all of it had cracked open on a sentence spoken in a root cellar by a woman who said, I am not asking you to rescue me. Because in all of Kale's long existence, across all the centuries and all the prayers and all the appeals that had reached him through the old channels, no one had ever said that. No one had ever come to him without wanting something that implied his power rather than his personhood. No one had ever spoken to the dark the way Sarah did, as though the dark was simply something to be honest with. He made a decision, in the ancient part of himself where decisions were made, that he was aware would change things. He was not certain he was wise in making it. He made it anyway. The carriages came for her at dawn, which was earlier than agreed and communicated, in the language of how power treats people it has decided it owns, that the agreement itself had been a courtesy extended conditionally, Sarah had her bag packed and her patients covered. Notes left for Corvin with enough detail that he would not be able to claim ignorance about any ongoing treatments. And she walked to the carriages with the posture of someone who had decided that how she carried herself mattered even in circumstances she had not chosen. Theron Malik looked faintly surprised by this, or perhaps by her lack of visible distress, and she found his surprise mildly satisfying in the way that small moments of dignity can be satisfying even within large circumstances of powerlessness. The journey to Vethis took 2 days, passing through increasingly urban pack territories, the architecture shifting from the timber and stone of the northern borderlands to the dense, imposing construction of a major pack center, buildings designed to communicate permanence and authority. Sarah spent the journey observing and thinking, which was what she generally did with her. Circumstances she could not change. She was the only passenger in the middle carriage. She was given meals without being given conversation. She was being transported rather than escorted, a distinction that told her something useful about how the council conceived of her current status. Vethis itself was larger than anywhere she had ever been, which was not saying much given that she had never left the Thresh region, but still the scale of it produced a complicated feeling in her chest. Something between awe and a specific kind of anger at the obscenity of concentrated wealth existing so close to the poverty she had grown up inside. The council headquarters occupied a building that had obviously been designed to produce feelings of insignificance in the people entering it, all soaring stone and deliberate grandeur, the architectural language of institutional power everywhere she looked. She was taken through a side entrance, which told her something else, and through corridors that bypassed the formal halls, which told her something else again. The room they brought her to was comfortable enough to be offensive, in the way that comfortable captivity is always slightly more offensive than obvious captivity, because it asks you to pretend the constraint is not there. She was told to rest, that the examination would begin in the morning, and the door was locked from the outside with a quietness that was its own kind of message. She had not brought her candles. She had almost brought them, had picked up the small traveling case she kept for them, and then put it down again, because something in her had decided that whatever was coming, she would face it with empty hands. But that night, in the locked, comfortable room in the Vethis Council headquarters, she did what she had done every night for 12 years. She sat on the floor, because the floor was more honest than the bed they had provided for her, and she spoke into the dark with the plain directness that had always been the only real thing she had to offer. She said, "I am in Vethis. They lock the door. I think they want to use me for something involving my bloodline. And I think when they say examination, they do not mean anything that is for my benefit. I am not asking you to come. I am not asking for anything. I know that is all I have ever said, but I want to be clear that I mean it as much now as I always have. I am telling you because 12 years of telling you, things has become the way I make sense of them. The world is easier to understand when I say it out loud to you, even if you are only a story, even if there is nothing on the other side of this." She paused, and then said something she had never said in 12 years of nightly prayer. She said, "Although if you are real, and if you have ever actually heard any of this, I think I would like very much for you to know that it has mattered to me. Talking to you has mattered. Whatever you are or are not, you have been the best company I have ever had, and I wanted to say that at least once before I stop having the privacy to say anything." The room was silent for a long moment. And then, in the dark, in a way that was not a sound and not a vision, but something that had no name in any modern framework, and that she would later struggle to describe to anyone, she felt something answer. Do not move away from this video yet, because what I am about to tell you is going to take everything you thought you understood about this story and turn it inside out. If you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment, because you are going to want to be here for what comes next. And leave me a comment telling me this. Did you feel that shift? Because Sarah felt it too. Let us keep going. It was not a voice precisely. It was more like the experience of being noticed by something that had the full weight of its attention to give, the opposite of the way she usually moved. Through the world, which was largely unnoticed except when she was useful. It was like standing in a dark room and suddenly understanding that the darkness had texture, that it was not empty space, but presence, vast and old and entirely oriented toward her. It lasted only a few seconds, and then it was gone, and Sarah sat very still in the middle of the locked room in Vathis, with the certain knowledge that something fundamental had changed, without being able to articulate what. She slept, in the end, because the body insists on its own pragmatism even when the mind is full of incomprehensible things. She slept and she dreamed, which was unusual because she rarely remembered her dreams, and what she dreamed was this: a forest that was and was not the ashwood, trees older than the concept of trees, a light that did not come from any source she could identify, but simply existed as a quality of the air itself, and somewhere in it, a stillness that was not absence, but the opposite of absence, the most thoroughly occupied silence she had ever experienced. She walked toward it in the dream, because she was Sarah Ashvale, and that was what she did with things she could not identify. She walked toward them rather than away, and she did not reach it before she woke, but she woke with the distinct impression that the stillness had been aware of her walking, and had waited. The examination that morning was not what she had expected, which was itself information. She had expected the medical theater of pack health assessments, the clinical atmosphere and official documentation. What she got instead was a room with 5 people in it, all senior by the look of their status markers, arranged around a central table in a configuration that was clearly designed to communicate unified authority. Theron Malik was there, his smile as calibrated as before. The woman at the head of the table was introduced as High Advisor Cressida Vorn, who was the kind of person whose power had aged into architecture, built into the way she occupied her chair, the angle of her spine, the precise economy of her attention. They told Sarah that the ancestral marker in her bloodline was called the Dawn Mark. They said it with the careful neutrality of people who had rehearsed the disclosure. They told her it appeared in fewer than a dozen living bloodlines and was associated with a direct genetic thread running back to the first age, which in practical terms meant she was carrying, in her blood, a sequence that had been replicated from something impossibly old. They told her this as though they were conferring information for her benefit, the way you explain a diagnosis to a patient, and Sarah sat across from them with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed, and thought that they were very practiced at pretending their interest was informational rather than extractive. She asked them what they wanted from her. High Advisor Vorn told her, with the directness of someone who had moved past the stage of soft framing, that the Dawn Mark, according to their research, was not merely a genealogical curiosity. It was, in the oldest accounts they had been able to reconstruct from first-age documents, a resonance key. The phrase was precise and deliberate, a bloodline that, under specific ritual conditions, could interact with the dormant architecture of first-age power in ways that modern bloodlines could not. She said this with the calm of someone presenting a useful tool, rather than discussing a human being, and Sarah noted this very carefully. She asked what specific ritual conditions meant. Vorn told her it meant that the council had, after decades of research, identified the location of what the first-age documents called the Primordial Anchor, a nexus point of original supernatural energy that predated all current pack territories, and that, if activated, would essentially rewrite the energetic hierarchy of the entire supernatural world, redistributing power. Concentrations that had calcified over centuries in ways that would benefit the Council's territorial interests enormously. She said territorial interests with a slight emphasis that was its own kind of honesty, the honesty of someone who knows, you know, they are lying about their benevolence and has decided to stop pretending. She told Sarah that the ritual required a Dawn Mark carrier to serve as the channel point. She said, serve as the channel point in the tone of someone who has decided that the technical language is more comfortable than the honest language, which would have been used as a conduit at significant personal cost. Sarah said, very quietly, personal cost meaning what exactly? Vorn said the historical accounts were not entirely clear on the degree of physical impact. Sarah translated this, in the privacy of her own mind, as significant probability of death, and felt the information settle into her body with the particular quality of unwelcome things that have been suspected, and are now confirmed. She said she needed time to consider. Vorn said, of course, with the smile of someone who has already decided that consideration will be provided in the same way that the comfortable locked room had been provided. Sarah returned to that room and sat on the floor and did not speak into the dark immediately. She sat with the information for a long time. She had a dawn mark. She carried in her blood a resonance connection to the first age, which meant to the primordial, which meant that 12 years of lighting candles in a stone alcove had not been purely a personal ritual after all. There was something in her that had been oriented toward that altar with a precision she had not understood. She thought about this with the steadiness that had always been her most reliable quality, the capacity to look at difficult truths without flinching away from them, to let them be what they were, rather than what would be more comfortable. She thought about the primordial and about whether he was real. And she thought about the dark of the previous night and the unmistakable sense of being noticed by something with the full weight of its attention. And she concluded with the quiet precision of someone doing genuine logical work that she believed he was. She thought about what the council wanted to do with her bloodline and his power. And she thought about the word anchor and the word activate and the word rewrite, and she concluded that whatever was being planned was not for any good larger than the council's own accumulation. She thought about what she was going to do about any of this. She was one unmated Omega with no status and no allies in a locked room in Vethis, surrounded by people who had the legal power of pack hierarchy on their side. The pragmatic analysis of her options was not encouraging. And yet Sarah Ashvale had been navigating pragmatically unjust circumstances her entire life, and she had learned something that the council, with its carefully constructed power and its impressive building and its condescending smiles, had not accounted for. She had learned that there is always something to do. It might not be what you wish you could do. It might not be sufficient, but there is always something, and the person who keeps looking for it is harder to defeat than they appear. She thought about her candles, and about honest prayers, and about a stillness in a dream that had waited for her to walk toward it, and she did something she had decided she would not do, but now did anyway. She spoke. She said, "I know you heard me last night. I know something changed. I am not going to perform not asking for help when I am telling you the full truth. And the full truth is that I think they want to use my blood to do something to your power. And I think they have not considered the possibility that you might object. I do not know what you are. I do not know if this is going to reach you, or if I am talking to myself in a locked room in the middle of a very bad situation. But I have been talking to you for 12 years, and I think you know me better than anyone alive, which is probably a strange thing to say about a legend. And I think if you are real, and if you have heard any of it, you know that I am not the kind of person who asks for things she does not genuinely need. I need this. Not rescue. Not someone to take over. Just to not be doing this alone." The room was very quiet, and then the quality of the air changed. It did not happen with thunder or light or any of the dramatic markers that the stories used. What happened was a deepening, the way the air in a room changes when someone very large and very quiet enters it, the way the space rearranges itself around a new gravity. Sarah felt it in the hair along her arms, in the particular alertness at the back of her skull, in the way her Omega nature, which generally registered dominant presences as a signal to make herself smaller, was instead producing something she could only describe as recognition. Not threat. Recognition. He was not physically present, not yet, which she understood with a certainty she could not have explained. What had arrived was something more primary than a body, a consciousness folding itself through the old channels that connected the first age to the present, using the dawn mark in her blood as a tuning fork, a resonance point through which to make contact. It was the most intimate experience she had ever had with another being, and they had not yet exchanged a single word. When he spoke, it was not with a sound. It was with a form of communication older than language, which her mind translated into words because words were the architecture her consciousness had available, the way a person born without color vision learns to understand color through other people's descriptions of it. What arrived in her understanding was this: I have heard you. Every night. All of them. I am sorry it took me this long to answer. Sarah sat very still with this for a moment that felt geological. She said inside herself in the same language, "Why did you wait so long?" There was something in the pause that followed that she could not have described except as honesty having to find its form. He said, "Because answering changes things. Because you were the first in many centuries who asked for nothing that used my power rather than my attention. Because I have been wrong about isolation being safer than contact, and I have been learning that slowly. And because watching someone as honest as you live, as alone as you have lived, is something I have found increasingly difficult to justify not responding to." Sarah said, "So you are real?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And you are the primordial." He said, "That is one of the things I have been called. The word I use for what I am is complicated. I am the first. I am very old. I am not what the stories made me." She said, "No. The stories made you a symbol, and you are clearly a person." The pause that followed had a different quality than the one before it. Something she would eventually come to recognize as the specific texture of being surprised by her, which happened to K.L. Dawnvane more than he had expected it to, and which he had found, before he had fully examined the feeling, that he did not want to stop experiencing. He said, "I cannot come to you the way I am now with enough presence to change your situation. The old channels are thin, but I can come fully. I need the primordial anchor for that, which is what the Council has been trying to use your bloodline to access. They do not know that the anchor does not work the way they think it does. It is not a power source they can direct. It is a doorway. It is where I left myself when I withdrew from the world, the part of me that required a tether, the ability to manifest fully in physical form. If they attempt their ritual with you as the channel, it will not give them control over first-age power. It will bring me back. And you would be injured in the attempt, because they will not be careful with you." Sarah said, "And if you came back through the anchor willingly," he said, "the Dawnmark carrier would still be the channel. But a willing channeling is entirely different from a forced one. The difference is the difference between a body of water that chooses to let a river pass through and one that is cut to force it." Sarah said, "You are asking me," he said. "I am telling you the situation and the options. The choice is yours. It has always been yours. I have not returned to this world in a very long time, and I would not begin by making choices for you." Sarah sat on the floor of the locked room in the Vethis Council headquarters, with the weight of the oldest being in the world, waiting in the dark of her blood for her answer, and she thought about it carefully and honestly the way she thought about everything. She thought about 12 years of candles and honest words, and the company she had not been lonely enough to pretend she had not valued. She thought about the council and their careful smiles, and their plans to use her as a tool. She thought about the ashwood, and the feeling of recognition it had always produced in her. She thought about the dream and the stillness that had waited, and she thought about a voice that had said, "You are the first in many centuries who asked for nothing that used my power rather than my attention." She said, "Tell me what I need to do." They came for her earlier than expected the second morning, which told her the council had either sensed something or operated on the principle that minimizing the interval between decisions and actions was safer when dealing with people of uncertain compliance. She was escorted by 2 alphas who were clearly not administrative staff, their bodies carrying the specific economy of movement that suggested trained enforcement, and they brought her, not back to the room with the advisors, but to a lower level of the building, which was older in its construction. The stonework a different period, the passages narrower and running in directions that suggested they predated the building above them by several centuries. Sarah had been right that there was a primordial anchor beneath the Vethis Council headquarters. She had not known until that moment that the council had built directly on top of it, which was a particular kind of audacity that she found she had to genuinely admire, even as it horrified her. The chamber they brought her to was large and circular and old, with the specific quality of age that is not merely physical, but atmospheric, the sense of accumulated time sitting in the air itself. The anchor was visible at the center of the room, as a column of light that was not quite light. More the implication of it. The place where the visual field acknowledged something present, that it did not have the tools to properly render. 5 council members were present, including Vorn and Malik, and there were others she had not met, their status markers indicating people from the upper strata of the council's hierarchy, people for whom this moment was the culmination of considerable investment and planning. Nobody looked at her with cruelty. They looked at her with the absence of relevant personhood, which she had spent enough of her life on the receiving end of to recognize, and to have developed a specific cold clarity about. Vorn told her the process, which was framed as a collaborative ritual, and which Sarah understood with the complete attention she had given to every detail of her situation, was not going to give her the opportunity to refuse once it started. There was a chair positioned in relation to the anchor that was clearly designed to be the channel point, and she was guided toward it by Malik's hand on her elbow, which was not rough, but was also not a question. She sat in the chair. She placed her hands on the armrests. She said quietly enough that only the people closest to her could hear, "I hope you are paying attention." Malik looked at her with a slight frown. Uncertain whether she was speaking to him or performing some personal ritual of her own that he did not need to concern himself with. She was not speaking to him. And then the ritual began. What happened in the next several minutes would be described very differently by the various people present in that chamber. Vorn's later account, in the documentation the council would spend considerable effort producing to explain and contain the narrative of events, described a technical malfunction of the channeling process resulting in an unexpected energy release. Malik never produced a formal account, because Malik was one of the 4 council members present, who, in the aftermath of what occurred, were found to have extensive documentation of bloodline trafficking, the buying and selling of individuals with Dawn mark sequences across pact territories for research purposes, and who faced significant legal consequences as a result of evidence that appeared, in ways the official investigation described as anomalous, in the Council's own secure record system. The 2 enforcement alphas present described, when interviewed separately by the Council of Reform that subsequently convened, a light that grew until it was not light, but something else, a pressure that was not physical, and then a man standing in the room who had not been there before, and whose presence had made both of them do something neither of them had ever done in their professional careers, which was to step backward without being ordered to. Sarah's experience was different from all of these. What she felt when the ritual began was the thin channels of the dawn mark in her blood, responding to the anchor's proximity, the way iron filings respond to a magnet, an alignment that was not compelled, but attracted, her nature leaning toward something it had always been oriented toward without understanding why. She felt it build, and she let it. Because she had said yes, and she had meant it, and what she had understood from Kale's communication was that the difference was entirely in the quality of that yes. She let the anchor's resonance move through her, the way a channel lets water move through it, shaping the flow without obstructing it. And she felt the moment when the flow became something other than abstract energy, became directed, became recognizable, became present. She felt the moment he arrived not as an external event, but as the completion of something she had not known was incomplete, the click of a key in a lock she had been carrying in her chest for 12 years without knowing what it opened. The light expanded, and then contracted, and then there was a man in the chamber who had not been there before. He was not what she had expected. She had expected something obviously supernatural, something that wore its extraordinary nature in obvious ways. What she saw was a man who stood as though standing was simply the position his body had arrived at after a very long journey, with the specific stillness of someone who has stopped moving because they have reached the place they were going, rather than because they are waiting. He was tall, in the way that felt like information, rather than just measurement, dark-haired, wearing clothes that were almost contemporary, but carried a quality that she could not quite name, except that they seemed to have decided to look contemporary, rather than simply being contemporary. His eyes, when they found her, were the color of the ashwood in winter, gray-green and old, carrying in them the specific quality of deep time that no cosmetic combination of features could have replicated. The look of someone who has seen the world accumulate itself over so many iterations that each current version of it is held simultaneously against all its previous versions. He looked at her. She had asked, every night for 12 years, to be seen. She had not known what that would feel like until it happened. It felt like standing in sunlight after a winter so long she had stopped being able to accurately remember warmth. He said, in a voice that was simply a voice, physical and present and carrying none of the impossible quality of their previous communication, because he was here now, real and embodied and occupying the same room and the same air. I am sorry that took so long. She said, you are here now. He said, yes. The 5 council members were present, and several of them were attempting to reassert control over the situation, and none of them were succeeding. Because when Cale Donvain turned to look at them, it was with the attention of something that had existed before their institution and their hierarchy and their careful accumulation of authority. And the weight of that attention was not threatening, but it was absolute. The way the ground is. Absolute. The way gravity does not negotiate. He said to them, in the same ordinary voice he had used with Sarah, you have been using the structures of this world in ways that the structures of this world do not permit you to use them. There is documentation of this in your own system. You will cooperate with the investigation that this documentation will produce. Vorn said, with remarkable composure given the circumstances. On whose authority? Cale looked at her for a moment. He said, on the authority of someone who has been watching you for considerably longer than you have been constructing these particular violations, and who finds the patience required to answer that question in terms you would accept somewhat taxing. But if you need a framework, the primordial anchor is not a council asset. It is not, and has never been, a tool available to pack governance structures. What you have built over it, and how you have attempted to use it, and what you have done to the people whose bloodlines you identified as useful to your plans, will be addressed through the mechanisms that exist for addressing these things, in full, with the evidence that has now made itself available. You may begin that process now, or you may continue asking me about authority, but I suggest the first option. There was a silence. Vorn sat down. The subsequent hours were complicated in the way that the immediate aftermath of large things is always complicated, full of the procedural and logistical and human noise that large events generate when they land in small real spaces. Sarah sat to the side of the chamber and let things happen around her, and did what she did best with circumstances that were processing themselves, which was observe and wait and stay out of the way of processes that did not need her intervention. Cale moved through the space with a patience that was clearly calibrated to the pace of the people he was dealing with, rather than to his own preferences, which she found she was watching with an attention she would have described to herself as professional interest if she was being slightly dishonest with herself. At some point he came and sat beside her, which required a small negotiation with the space between them that she was hyper-aware of in the way that physical proximity with someone you have been intimate with, in a non-physical sense for an extended period, can be hyper-aware of. He did not sit too close. He sat at a distance that communicated awareness of the strangeness of the situation for her. She appreciated this in a way she did not immediately know what to do with. He said, "How are you?" She considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, and said, "Strange. Intact," thinking very quickly about several things at once. He said, "I should tell you the channeling will leave you tired for a few days but cause no structural damage. Your dawn mark is unaffected." She said, "Good." She said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "You have been asking me things for 12 years. Please do not stop now." She felt something shift in her chest at this, and filed it for later examination. She said, "What happens now?" Not in the council sense, in the you sense. He was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of someone choosing honest words rather than convenient ones. He said, "I genuinely do not know. I have been absent from the world for a very long time. The world is different in ways I am still in the process of assessing. I know that I am here, and that being here was the right decision, and that there are things that need addressing that I was not addressing from the remove I had established. Beyond that, I am not planning at a level of detail that would allow me to give you a confident answer. She said, I appreciate the honesty. He said, it seems discourteous to be less than honest with someone who has been entirely honest with me for 12 years. She looked at him, at the gray-green eyes with their freight of time, at the face that was a man's face, and also somehow the face of the world's oldest thing. And she said, did it help? Hearing all of it, he was quiet for long enough that she understood the question had reached somewhere that required real excavation. He said, it reminded me what being moved feels like. It reminded me that there were things worth coming back for. It reminded me, consistently and despite my best efforts to remain at an appropriate distance, that isolation I chose for reasons that seemed wise when I chose them had become something else over time, something more like hiding. It helped in the way that the most significant things help, which is not by being comfortable. She nodded. She said, I know that kind of help. He said, I know you do. They sat together in the large old chamber, while the procedural aftermath of the day continued around them, and the silence between them had the quality of all the conversations that had preceded it, the 12 years of her speaking honestly into the dark. Except that now the dark was here and sitting beside her, and the silence was not empty, but full, occupied by two people in the process of understanding what they were to each other, now that the distance had closed. In the weeks that followed, the world changed in ways that would have been impossible to predict, and that Sarah watched with the particular attention of someone who has been at the center of the earthquake and is now observing the aftershocks from a position of unusual perspective. The Council investigation produced results that shocked people who had been comfortable not knowing what was being done in the comfortable rooms above which their comfortable governance had operated. 17 senior advisors were removed from their positions. 6 territorial policies were suspended pending review. The Bloodline Research Program was dissolved with the particular speed of institutions responding to sudden accountability, attempting to distance themselves from what they had sanctioned. In the same way that all institutions attempt to distance themselves from the consequences of their choices when those choices become undeniable. Kyle was present through all of it in ways that were consistent with his stated intention, which was not to govern but to witness, not to replace one center of power with another, but to ensure that the accountability that should have existed all along was no longer avoidable. He was patient in this work, with a patience that Sarah recognized as genuine. Rather than performed, the patience of someone for whom time is not a resource running out, but a medium being moved through with appropriate care. He met with pack leaders and territorial councils, and the networks of ordinary wolves whose lives had been directly affected by the practices being dismantled, and he brought to each of those meetings the combination of absolute authority and complete absence of personal agenda that was, as far as Sarah could observe, the most unsettling quality he possessed to the people accustomed to power having an agenda. He returned, consistently, to Thresh. This was not something she had expected, and it was something she thought about with the careful honesty she brought to everything she thought about. He returned to the village, and he stayed in the empty cottage next to hers, that had been vacant for 2 years, and he did not demand anything of her proximity, did not establish the kind of gravitational claim that the mate bond mythology she had grown up with would have suggested was inevitable between a primordial and his Dawnmark carrier. He was simply there. He helped in the village in ways that were useful and unassuming, a skill set, it turned out, that being the oldest living being conveyed, the ability to be helpful in ways that required very little exhibition of the power behind them. He knew things about the forest that nobody else knew. He knew things about plants. He was very good at sitting with frightened patients, which did not surprise Sarah at all, because she had heard his voice in her head, and she knew the specific quality of his attention, and she understood that it would produce that effect. They talked. This was the part she had expected, and had not known how to prepare for. The translation of something that had been entirely internal and one-directional for 12 years into something bilateral and embodied. She had worried that it would be strange, that the intimacy she had developed speaking into the dark would not survive the presence of an actual person with actual physicality and an actual history that was so vast it should have been impossible to hold. It was not strange. It was the easiest conversation she had ever had with another person. The simplest passage from thought to language, because she already knew how to be honest with him, and he already knew her honesty was not a performance. And they were both, it turned out, people who would rather say the difficult true thing than the comfortable. Approximate 1. He told her things about the first age that no historical record contained. Told them with the particular wistfulness of someone who has watched everything he loved be reduced to myth, and who finds the act of recounting the reality both necessary and slightly painful. He told her about the world before pack hierarchies, the complexity of it, the things that had been lost, and the things that had, against considerable odds, survived. He told her about choosing to withdraw, and what that choice had cost him, and what he thought it had been worth. He was honest about the costs in a way that she found both difficult and necessary to hear. She told him things she had never said out loud, thoughts that had existed only in the private space of her nightly prayers, articulating for the first time in the company of a real listener the interior landscape that she had been inhabiting alone for 24 years. She told him about the specific texture of her loneliness and what she had learned to build inside it. She told him about the dawn mark and what it had felt like to discover that her orientation toward the old altar had not been purely personal mythology, about the complicated feelings that produced, the validation, and the strangeness of learning that something you chose was also in some way chosen for you. She asked him about this directly, which was the only way she knew how to address anything. She said, "Did the dawn mark make you hear me differently than you would have heard anyone else?" He said, "It made me able to hear you. It did not determine how I responded to what I heard." She said, "That distinction matters to me." He said, "I know it does. It matters to me, too." They were sitting in the root cellar, which she had shown him because it seemed right to show him the place where 12 years of candlelight had accumulated, and the small stone alcove with its shallow depression was there between them, with the weight of everything it represented. He was looking at it with an expression she was learning to read, the expression of someone encountering evidence of something that moved them, which in Cale's case involved a stillness rather than any outward sign, a deepening of the quality of presence he already brought to everything. He said, "I want to tell you something that is true, and that I have thought carefully about how to say." She said, "Say it simply. I prefer that." He said, "I came back to the world because the situation required it. I stayed because of you. That is not the dawn mark, and it is not obligation, and it is not what any story or mythology would make of it. It is a choice I have made in full possession of what I am, and what I have been through, and what I understand a choice like this to cost. And I am making it with open eyes. You are the most honest person I have encountered in a very long time, and the world is significantly better for you being in it, and I have found that proximity to that is something I am not willing to give up without very good reason." Sarah sat with this for a long time. The root cellar was quiet, and the small stone alcove was there, and the ashwood was outside, and the world above them was full of the ordinary sound of a village going about its evening. She thought about choice, and about compulsion, and about the years she had spent insisting to herself that a real relationship could only be built on mutual and conscious choice, rather than supernatural inevitability. She thought about what he had just said, and she found that it met the standard she had constructed for herself, met it not because it was a grand gesture or a magical promise, but because it was specific and honest, and offered without any implication that she was required to receive it in any particular way. She said, "I have been waiting for something I could not name for my entire life. I think I would like to find out if this is it." He said, "I think I would too." Outside, the ashwood stood as it had stood for longer than memory, old and patient and full of the particular kind of presence that predated every hierarchy and every institution and every story that had been built to explain it. And inside the root cellar of a small cottage at the edge of a village that most of the world had never heard of, two people who had known each other for 12 years were meeting for the first time and finding, with the careful attention of those who know that real things require real tending, that what they were building between them was something that might, with honesty and time and the willingness to keep choosing it, become extraordinary. Before we get to the epilogue, I need to know something. Are you on team? This is the most earned slow burn you have ever witnessed. Or are you still processing the root cellar scene? Drop it in the comments because I am reading every single one. Hit that like button if you have been holding your breath for the last 20 minutes. And if you found this story through a recommendation, welcome, subscribe, because this is what we do here. Now, 12 months later, epilogue. A year passed the way years pass when they are full of real things rather than the performance of living, quickly in retrospect, and with density when examined. The council reforms moved through their various stages of the kind of institutional change that is always slower than the urgency of the need for it, but faster than the institutions themselves would. Choose. And Cale's involvement in those processes was consistent with the approach he had described, the application of presence and clarity, and the particular quality of attention that made it very difficult for convenient forgetting to take hold. Sarah watched this work with the admiration she had developed for things done with appropriate care rather than expedient force, and she continued her own work in Thresh with the difference that she was no longer underpaid for it and no longer consulted less than her knowledge deserved, because Cale had made clear, without making it about his authority, that the conditions under which she had been working were the product of exactly the kind of structural unfairness that the reforms were designed to address, and the village hierarchy had found it did not wish to be the example that illustrated the point. She had moved her candle ritual from the root cellar to the cottage window. This was a change that was partly practical. The candles caught more light at the window, and partly symbolic in a way she was fully aware of, the ritual that had been private becoming visible, the prayer that had been spoken into darkness being offered now to the open air. She still lit one every evening. She had explained to Kyle, when he asked about it with the careful curiosity that was one of the things she had come to deeply appreciate about him, that it was not that the ritual had become unnecessary now that the prayers had been answered. It was that it had changed its meaning. It was no longer a reaching toward the unknown. It was an acknowledgement of what was present, a nightly practice of noticing what she had and choosing to see it clearly. He had been quiet for a while after this, and then he had said, "I have been trying for several months to identify exactly what it is about the way you think that I find so continuously remarkable. I believe this is it." She had told him that was a very long way of paying someone a compliment, and he had said that after a certain number of centuries, brevity and emotional expression began to feel dishonest, and she had laughed, which was something she did considerably more of this year than she had done in all the years before it combined. The relationship between them had developed with the pace that both of them, for different reasons, had independently concluded was right, which was carefully and with attention to the fact that they were two very different people, with very different histories building something neither of them had a clean template for. He was not human, and had never been. She was not whatever he was, and had not expected to become it. There were things about his nature that required ongoing negotiation, the way he perceived time, the way the weight of his history occasionally settled over him in ways that she could not share, but could learn to sit with, the particular loneliness of existing outside the normal parameters of a life. There were things about her that he was patient with, in ways that she sometimes found more confronting than she expected, because she had organized her life around self-sufficiency, and his patience with her difficulty accepting help required its own ongoing recalibration. They disagreed sometimes, because they were both people who had strong views, and neither of them was inclined to manage conflict by pretending it was not there, and their disagreements were conducted with the honesty that had been the foundation of everything between them, and were resolved with the same quality of honest attention. She had asked him one evening, when the ashwood was silver with winter fog, and the candle in her window was the warmest light in the visible landscape, whether he was happy. She asked it simply and directly the way she asked everything. He had taken a long time to answer, not because he did not know the answer, but because he was, as she had come to understand, someone who treated important words with the respect of finding the exactly right ones. He said, "I have existed for long enough that the concept of happiness has become something I approach with significant caution, because I have learned that the things that feel like happiness in any given moment have to be held lightly enough to survive the moments when they are not present. But what I can tell you is that I did not expect to be here. I did not expect the world to produce something I could not have predicted. At this point in my existence, I did not expect you. And the experience of daily life, in which there is something I did not expect and did not plan for and cannot fully account for, is the closest thing I have encountered in a very long time to what I would call being alive, in the way I was alive at the beginning, when everything was new. So yes, I think that is what this is. She had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "That is a very Kale answer." He had said, "I am working on brevity." She had said, "Do not." I like it. The ashwood stood as it always had, old and patient and holding its long history in the texture of its bark and the quality of its silence. And in the cottage at its edge, a candle burned in the window the way a candle had burned in that house for 12 years, steady and honest and seen. No longer a prayer sent into the unknown, but an acknowledgement of what had been found, what had answered, and what was being built, carefully and with full attention, in the ordinary, miraculous space of two people choosing each other with open eyes. The legend was real. The loneliness was over. The work of everything that came next, the sustained and unglamorous and deeply meaningful work of a life shared between two people who had decided to truly know each other, had just begun. And that is where I am going to leave them, in that cottage with that candle and that forest and that beginning, because the best endings are the ones that feel like the start of something rather than the close of it. If this story moved you, I want to know. Leave a comment with the moment that got you the most, whether it was the root cellar, the chamber, the first real conversation, the epilogue. I read every single one, and I respond to as many as I can. Please hit the like button, because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of story. The kind where the love is earned and the characters are real, and the ending is not a fairy tale, but something better, something that requires actual work and actual honesty and the courage to choose. Subscribe if you have not, because there are more stories where this came from, and I will see you in the next one.